Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I will tell you about the HOA and the neighbor who teamed up to evict me from my house. I've always considered myself a pretty patient person, but when the nonsense started, I realized I had been too trusting. I live in a small community with a homeowners association that, until recently, I'd never really had any major problems with. Sure, the HOA was always a bit strict, grousing about people leaving their trash bins out a few hours too long, or lecturing residents about lawn heights, but I'd always kept my head down and followed the basic guidelines. I never wanted to stir up trouble. I'm just a single homeowner who likes to tinker with woodworking projects in the garage, tend to my modest herb garden out back, and sip coffee on the porch on Saturdays. I'd paid off most of my mortgage and settled into what I thought would be a peaceful routine, but that changed abruptly when my neighbor, a man named Howard, started knocking on my front door one afternoon. I'd never had a bad interaction with him before. He rarely said more than a polite hello, and we'd never argued. I didn't know much about him at all. He lived 2 houses down, often drove a large car that always seemed freshly detailed, and was rumored to be involved in local real estate deals. He stood on my porch that day with a broad smile I didn't trust from the moment I saw it. Maybe it was the way his eyes didn't quite match his grin, or the fact that he was shifting on his feet like he had news he knew I wouldn't like. "Good afternoon," he said, sounding way too friendly. "I've got an offer for you." I should have asked him to leave right then and there, but not knowing what he wanted, I invited him in, offered him a glass of water, and listened. He started weaving this strange story about how the market was changing and how he was involved with some improvements planned for our community. Eventually, he came to the point. "I want to buy your house. I'm prepared to pay, well, let's say I'm prepared to pay about 30% of what it's worth." He said it casually, like he was doing me a favor. I nearly choked on my water. "You want to what?" I asked. I might not be a real estate expert, but I'm no fool. My home was paid off enough that I had plenty of equity. It had appreciated nicely over the years. The idea that I would sell it for some fraction of its market value was ridiculous. I told him flat out that I wasn't interested. He gave me that greasy smile again and shrugged. "You might want to reconsider," he said. "It'll be better for everyone." Then he left, giving me a wink as if he knew something I didn't. I felt a cold shiver up my spine, but I brushed it off. People sometimes try to pull weird stunts in real estate, hoping to catch you at a desperate moment. I figured I had just dealt with a random hustle. A few days later, a letter from the HOA landed in my mailbox. It cited a series of supposed violations. My front lawn grass was half an inch taller than the recommended maximum. My fence had paint that was not on the approved color list. My back deck railing didn't meet some obscure regulation that had apparently been quietly passed a month earlier. Normally, if I had a minor issue, the HOA would just send a friendly reminder. This was a stack of official-looking notices, each threatening fines and potential legal action if I didn't remedy the problems immediately. I was surprised, to say the least. I walked around my property. My lawn looked fine. Sure, maybe I had been a day late in mowing, but half an inch off wasn't something they'd ever cared about before. The paint on my fence was the same that had been there since I moved in, originally approved by the HOA. The deck railing met code. I'd replaced it 2 years ago with a contractor who specialized in building to HOA standards. All these claims were nonsense. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting to clear things up. When I got there, I was shocked to find Howard sitting right next to the HOA president, a woman named Marcia, whispering in her ear. I had never known Howard to be involved in community affairs. I stood up and politely asked about the violation notices. Instead of reason, I got condescension. Marcia told me that the board had reassessed community standards and found my property lacking. When I pressed further, she gave me a thin-lipped smile and repeated that I'd need to fix the issues or face escalating penalties. I left that meeting furious, but still trying to remain calm. I hired a lawn care service to do a perfect job on the grass. I repainted the fence with the exact brand and color on the HOA's so-called approved list. I brought a building inspector I knew, an old friend from my college days, who confirmed my deck railing was 100% to code, local and HOA standards included. I documented everything. A week passed. Another notice arrived. This time they said my mailbox was too close to the curb and that my backyard hedges were overgrown, even though I'd just trimmed them. They also demanded that I update my siding, which hadn't changed in a decade and had never been a problem. All these fines were starting to pile up. I tried to appeal, but the HOA board refused to grant me a fair hearing. I was starting to suspect something more sinister was going on. Soon after, Howard came by again. He caught me as I was rolling in my trash bin. He leaned against my fence as if he owned the place. "Getting a lot of trouble from the HOA?" he asked in a mocking tone. I decided to play dumb. "Yeah, strange stuff. Don't know why suddenly they're nitpicking," I said. He nodded, feigning sympathy. "It's tough when the neighborhood standards go up and you can't keep up. Maybe it would be better for everyone if you sold. I'm still interested, by the way. If you're ready to talk numbers, let's say, I can do 30% of the appraised value and I'll even cover closing costs." I was tempted to tell him off right there, but I kept my cool. It was obvious now that he'd gotten in tight with the HOA board and was using them to pressure me into selling. This was a coordinated effort. Drive me out with non-stop fines and bogus demands so I'd cave and accept a lowball offer. I wondered if Howard had plans to flip the house quickly or if he wanted to tear it down and build something else. Either way, he was not getting my home for a fraction of its value. I said no. Again. He smirked and walked away, calling over his shoulder. "We'll see." The next day, another thick envelope arrived. This one a collection of fines and warnings. The letter threatened legal action if I didn't comply. The problem was, I had tried to comply, and every time I fixed one thing, they invented another. Also, I knew something else. Even HOAs have to follow certain rules. They can't just invent violations out of thin air and expect to enforce them. They can't demand a homeowner sell their property. This was harassment, plain and simple. I decided I needed a lawyer. I contacted an attorney I knew named Eva. She was a sharp professional who specialized in property rights and had successfully fought HOAs before. I explained the situation, and Eva whistled softly. "They're trying to force a sale? That's outrageous and illegal. Let's gather evidence." She told me to keep a log of every interaction, save every letter, record conversations if it was legal in my state. It was, as long as I was a participant, and take photos and videos of my property to prove compliance. Over the next few weeks, I followed her advice. The HOA continued escalating. They showed up with inspectors who claimed I needed to replace my driveway. They said my porch light was too bright and that I must use a specific brand. They claimed my backyard shed was built too close to the property line, something no one had ever mentioned before. I calmly collected all their claims, documented my compliance, and then noted down every inconsistency. I also started noticing Howard's involvement more explicitly. He attended every HOA meeting now, sitting right beside Marcia, whispering in her ear. Two other board members, Davis and Irene, seemed uneasy about what was going on but didn't speak up much. I managed to record Howard in a casual conversation after a meeting. He openly bragged to another neighbor, who seemed sympathetic to him, about his plans to acquire my property at a bargain. I got it all on tape. My attorney suggested filing a formal complaint, so I did. I drafted a detailed letter with Eva's help and sent it to the HOA board, stating I was aware of their collusion with Howard, that they were issuing bogus violations, and that I would be pursuing legal action if they continued. I asked for a fair hearing before a neutral party. The response I got was laughably predictable. They denied everything and doubled down, insisting I had to comply with their demands or they would consider foreclosure proceedings. They had the gall to suggest they might forcibly take my home to pay for the so-called fines. At this point, I knew it wasn't just intimidation. They were prepared to try something legally reckless. It's important to understand that in the United States, while HOAs hold a certain amount of power, they can't just go around making up rules post factum and stealing your property. If they want to claim I'm in violation of something, they must point to a specific rule that predated the alleged violation, and they must give me a fair process to fix it. They can't just retroactively decide my fence color is wrong and threaten foreclosure the next day. And they certainly can't force me to sell my home to a private individual for a fraction of its worth. I was gathering a mountain of evidence. I had the original community guidelines, dated photos of my property showing I was in compliance for years, letters from previous HOA boards approving my deck railing and fence paint color, and now these new notices that conflicted with all the old permissions. I had recordings where Howard hinted at his arrangement with the board. Eva was pleased with the evidence. "We'll teach them a lesson," she said with confidence. As we prepared to sue, I learned from a different neighbor, someone who'd lived there longer than me, that Howard was known for shady dealings. He was behind a few renovation projects in the neighborhood that conveniently increased HOA fees and reduced common area upkeep. leading some original owners to sell at lower prices. He'd snatch those properties, flip them, and profit. This time, he apparently wanted my home. Maybe it was bigger than the others he'd acquired. Maybe he saw potential in its location on a corner lot. Or maybe he just didn't like me because I wouldn't roll over. Whatever the reason, I was not going to let him bulldoze me. A tense period followed. The HOA started sending official-looking but obviously doctored documents. They cited a non-existent community improvement measure supposedly passed the previous year, claiming I was in violation for not submitting to a mandatory siding replacement. I checked old meeting minutes, which I had previously requested and carefully read, and found no record of such a measure. I started to suspect forgery. On a hunch, I contacted a few homeowners who were active in the community back then. None recalled any vote on siding replacements. I had proof that the HOA was fabricating rules. This was golden evidence for my lawsuit. But even as I built my case, I had to protect myself against the possibility they might escalate. So, I installed security cameras around my home. Sure enough, a week later, I caught one of Howard's associates, some guy I recognized as having attended an HOA meeting, sneaking around at night and photographing my property lines. He tried to pry open my mailbox, maybe looking for mail that could be used against me or something else. I called the police and reported trespassing. The police took a report and I gave them the footage. While they might not immediately arrest the guy without more context, the record was there, another piece of the puzzle. With a strong case, Eva filed the lawsuit. Harassment, attempted fraud, and violation of my rights as a homeowner. We named the HOA and Howard specifically. We asked for damages, attorney's fees, and a court order preventing them from engaging in these tactics. I'd never sued anyone before, and to be honest, it felt a bit overwhelming, but I knew I had no choice. These people were trying to steal my home through intimidation and legal gymnastics. I was just defending what was rightfully mine. When the HOA and Howard got served with the lawsuit, the response was swift. Marcia called an emergency meeting for members only. I knew from a neighbor who attended that meeting, she spilled the beans afterward, that Howard was livid. He ranted and raved about how I was ruining a great opportunity and that he had spent considerable money expecting my property to be his. He told the board to fight tooth and nail. Marcia seemed nervous. Howard assured them that my claims were baseless. But I had a feeling not everyone on the board was so sure. Davis and Irene, the two who had seemed uneasy, voted to try settling early on, but Howard and Marcia overruled them. The legal battle began in earnest. Eva was a wizard at depositions. She subpoenaed HOA records, meeting minutes, financial statements, everything. We discovered irregularities in how the board had been recording their votes. Some decisions were never properly noted. Others contradicted established policies. We found documents showing Howard had made donations to the HOA's beautification fund right before they started hounding me with bogus violations. We also found emails, secured through legal discovery, where Howard explicitly told Marcia that once I was forced out, he'd pay her a consultation fee for helping the process along. This was blatant corruption. Our evidence was overwhelming. The HOA's attorney tried to argue that I was in violation of legitimate rules, but when pressed, they couldn't produce a consistent set of guidelines. They tried to claim I'd neglected my property, but my dated photographs and professional inspections refuted that. They tried to say I'd refused to cooperate, but I had detailed notes of all the remedial actions I took and their shifting goalposts. As for Howard, he tried to distance himself, claiming he was just a concerned neighbor interested in buying property. But the emails told a different story. The judge was not amused. We pushed for a settlement. At first, they resisted. Howard was confident I would break under legal pressure. But when the judge allowed our key evidence, those incriminating emails, to be admitted, their attorney realized they were doomed if it went to trial. A settlement offer landed on Eva's desk. They'd drop all the fines, pay me a token amount, and guarantee they would leave me alone if I agreed not to pursue the matter further. I was insulted by the token amount. After all I'd been through, a token amount wouldn't cut it. Eva advised me to hold out. We had them cornered. Either they settled fairly or we'd go to trial, and I'd ask for even more in damages. It was a risk, but I believed in my case. A second offer came in, more substantial. Eva crunched the numbers, and after some back and forth, we agreed on a final amount. I can't give exact figures here, but let's say it was around $120,000. This wasn't just about the money, it was about sending a message. The HOA and Howard had tried to bully a homeowner into selling at a fraction of the price, and now they were paying dearly for that mistake. As part of the settlement, the HOA president, Marcia, stepped down. They had to publicly confirm that my property was in full compliance, wipe all the bogus fines, and pay my legal fees on top of the settlement amount. Howard had to sign a statement that he would cease all attempts to acquire my property. Moreover, his donations to the HOA would be scrutinized by their new treasurer, ensuring no more shady deals. I thought this concluded the matter, but the aftermath was even more interesting. The community got wind of what happened. Word spread that Howard had tried this tactic before with more subtlety and gotten away with it. Now that he was exposed, several other neighbors who'd sold under suspicious pressure felt emboldened to consult lawyers and might eventually go after him. He might face further legal trouble down the line. For a while, I considered selling the house at full market value just to be done with this whole neighborhood drama. But ultimately, I loved my home. I loved my little herb garden, my wood shop in the garage, and the familiarity of the space I'd curated over the years. I decided to stay. With Howard out of my hair and the HOA on a much tighter leash, I could enjoy my home in peace. The new HOA board members who replaced Marcia were far more reasonable. They knocked on my door a few weeks after the settlement with sincere apologies. They told me they were reviewing all policies to ensure nothing like this ever happened again. They asked if I had any suggestions. I gave them a list of transparent procedures and fairness measures, like requiring documented evidence before issuing a violation notice and giving homeowners a real opportunity to fix issues before fines. To my pleasant surprise, they agreed to adopt several of my proposals. Over time, the tension faded. I still see Howard occasionally drive by. He avoids eye contact now, no longer the smug, scheming figure he was before. Rumor has it he's trying to sell his own home, but now everyone in the neighborhood knows who he is and what he tried to do, so buyers are cautious. He might have to accept far less than he originally planned to gain. Quite the ironic twist. One subplot that took an unexpected turn involves Davis and Irene from the HOA board. After the dust settled, they started their own mini neighborhood integrity committee. Not an official body, just a couple of residents working with neighbors to ensure everyone understands the rules and that any changes are communicated clearly. They take time to talk to homeowners and gather input before the HOA makes any big decisions. By doing this, they're helping restore trust in an organization that had lost its way. Another small storyline that emerged after the lawsuit was my relationship with a few neighbors I barely knew before. After hearing about my ordeal, a neighbor named Trish, who lived a few blocks over, invited me to a small backyard gathering. I met other homeowners who had either been targeted by the previous HOA board or were just tired of the confusion and lack of transparency. We ended up forming a small network, a kind of informal neighborhood watch, not in the sense of stopping crime, but in keeping an eye on the HOA's activities and ensuring fairness. I also got to resolve an unrelated dispute that had been lingering with another neighbor named Jonah. Before all this happened, Jonah and I had a minor disagreement about a shared fence post. It was something trivial, and we never really sat down to talk it through. But after I stood up to the HOA and Howard, Jonah approached me. He admitted he might have been too particular about that fence post, and I admitted I could have communicated better. We ended up having a friendly chat and solved the fence matter with no drama. That small resolution, in the wake of a much larger conflict, reminded me that most neighbors are reasonable people, and misunderstandings often come down to simple miscommunication. Looking back, I never thought I'd be dragged into a legal battle just to keep my home from predatory neighbors and a corrupt HOA board. It taught me a few lessons. First, it's crucial to know your rights as a homeowner and stand up for them. Second, documenting everything matters. My organized records and careful collection of evidence made the difference between winning and losing. Third, sometimes the only way to deal with bullies is to push back harder than they ever expected. Had I caved in at the first sign of trouble, I would have lost my home at a fraction of its value. Instead, I forced them to pay me a large settlement and restore fairness to the community. The most unexpected outcome is that the neighborhood is now a better place. With Marcia gone and Howard's influence revealed for what it was, the HOA is more transparent. Rules are enforced fairly, and no one is pressured to sell. The community seems friendlier overall. People now talk openly about any changes under consideration. We have clearer guidelines that are actually written down and distributed to all homeowners. There is a process for appealing fines, and no secret meetings happen without notice. I've since expanded my herb garden. I added a few raised beds for tomatoes and peppers, and I built a nice arbor for climbing roses. No one complains about it, and in fact, one of the new board members complimented me on the improvements. My wood shop in the garage is busier than ever. I've started making small items for neighbors, birdhouses, planters, and even a custom mailbox for Trish. The suspicious surveillance and trespassing are things of the past. I sleep better at night without worrying about someone sneaking around my property trying to conjure up a new violation. While the settlement money certainly helped pay for my legal fees and a few home upgrades, the biggest reward was the principle of it all. Standing my ground and not letting them bully me out of my home felt right. Knowing that the law was on my side and that their scheme had no legal footing affirmed my belief in fairness. They had counted on me being ignorant, afraid, or too financially strained to fight. Instead, they got a homeowner who learned quickly, took careful steps, and wouldn't back down. It's interesting how an ugly conflict can lead to positive change. Without Howard's attempt to push me out, the HOA might have continued on a path of increasing corruption. Other homeowners might have silently suffered, selling their homes at a loss because they believed they had no choice. Now, the neighborhood has a precedent. If anyone tries to pull something like that again, people know what to do. They know to gather evidence, seek legal advice, and stand up for themselves. Knowledge is a powerful deterrent against wrongdoing. I'm not going to pretend that the ordeal didn't weigh on me. It did. I lost sleep, I was anxious during the legal process, and I wondered if some technical loophole might let them hurt me financially. Lawsuits aren't fun, even when you're on the right side. But Eva was a brilliant attorney, and my patience and documentation paid off. I learned a lot about property laws, HOA bylaws, and legal procedures. Knowledge I never thought I'd need. If I could give advice to anyone who finds themselves in a similar situation, it would be this: don't panic. Don't let them intimidate you into rash decisions. Document absolutely everything and get a lawyer who knows the territory. Don't hesitate to challenge suspicious actions. HOAs can have real authority, but they are not above the law. They can't force you to sell your property for pennies on the dollar. They can't fabricate rules and fines out of thin air, and if they try, you have the right to fight back. In the end, I still live in my home. It's as comfortable as ever, with improvements and a stronger sense of security. The HOA is now run by more honest people who value clarity and fairness. Howard's plan backfired spectacularly. Instead of making a profit off my property, he ended up costing himself and his allies a hefty sum, around $120,000, and their reputations in the community. So that's my story. The neighborhood tried to push me out to get a cheap deal on my home, thinking I would just run away. Instead, I stood my ground, fought back, and not only kept my home, but also got them to pay me a substantial amount in the process. Sometimes the best revenge is not just winning, but setting things right so no one else has to suffer the same way. Friends, thank you. See you soon.